founder of Sallie Tomato, and I am so excited to be here for another video in the bag sewing series. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We are going to be making a backpack. And don't worry, I'll be here every step of the way to show you the process of how to make this pattern. So I designed this pattern named Joanna, another exclusive design for Missouri Star. And the bag features a front flap, a drawstring closure, there's interior pockets and adjustable straps and also a handle. So this is really fun to feature some prints and also some unique fabrics like cork or faux leather. So we are going to get started on fusing the interfacing to the coordinating pieces. All right, so we're going to start with your main fabric, and the pieces that we need to add some interfacing to for some extra stability are the drawstring. So it's just a small piece for the drawstring tab, and the strap connectors, and then also the lining for the flap closure. We'll also need to add interfacing to some of the lining panels just to add a little bit more structure to the lining. So there's a front and back piece, and what I like to do is mark the wrong side of my lining since it is a lighter lining fabric. I do like to use lighter linings on the inside, so when you open up your bag, then you can see a little bit better. If you use a darker fabric, it's going to be a little bit harder to see what's inside. So I went ahead and marked on the wrong side those pieces for the front and back, and you'll need to iron interfacing to your side panels and also the base for the lining. And I'll show you how to add interfacing to the drawstring. It's going to be a little bit different. So let's start with the drawstring tab. And I recommend using a lightweight woven interfacing that has a fusible on it. So if you just feel with your fingers, the bumpy side has the glue on it, so that's the fusible side. And you just place it on the wrong side of the fabric, align all the edges, and press. So definitely check with what type of interfacing that you're using for how long to hold the iron on for those instructions. And then next we'll fuse it to the strap connectors. So place it against the wrong side and press. I've already went ahead and fused the interfacing to my flap and my lining panels. So for the drawstring, it's a little bit different. You're going to position lay out your drawstring onto your ironing mat, and you'll want to position the interfacing so that way there's about a ½ inch of fabric that does not have any interfacing on the end. And I'm using multiple pieces for my drawstring to meet the length that is needed for the pattern. So go ahead and fuse the first piece. I'm just going to flip this around, and when you go to fuse the second piece of interfacing, just overlap the interfacing by about a1/4 inch. So what I found, if you match up the interfacing ends, your finished strap might crease at that area where they're joined, so that's why I always just overlap a little bit. So that's just a little tip for a professional look and the durability. And at this other end, I'm just going to trim the interfacing so that way there's that ½ inch of fabric without any interfacing on the end. So you can set all these pieces aside, and we are going to attach the foam stabilizer to the coordinating pieces next. So you have your main fabric for the exterior of the bag. So there are 2 pieces, one for the front, one for the back, and then your side panels. And then we're using a contrasting fabric for the base. So I chose cork fabric. It's very durable and lightweight, so it's a great option for the bottom of the bag. And there's a piece of foam for each piece. So you're going to place the wrong side of your fabric against one foam piece and align all the edges. And you can use some basting spray or sewing clips to hold the layers together. So just add some clips all the way around. And then at the machine, we're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance and baste from all 4 sides of each piece for the main fabrics. So you can adjust your stitch length so it's a little bit longer. You can go about 4 millimeters or 5 millimeters. It's just attaching the fabric to the foam. I've already went ahead and stitched the back to the foam and also each of the side panels. So those are ready to go and can be set aside. For the base, you're going to center the wrong side against the foam and align all the edges. But this time we're going to use 5/8 inch seam allowance. And just like in all the other tutorials, I am using a contrasting thread so you can see my stitches, but you might want to use a coordinating thread so the stitches kind of blend and match your fabric. So this will actually be seen after the bag is done. So you'll want to reduce your stitch length down to 3 millimeters for a top stitch. And I'm just using the guide on my needle plate to get the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Can trim up any loose threads and flip this over to the wrong side, and you're going to trim the foam from the seam allowance close to the stitches, but just be careful that you don't cut your fabric or through the stitches. So this will help reduce some of the bulk and help with a nice smooth finish along the base at the end. So here's what the base will look like after trimming. You can set aside. Then you're going to take the female half of your magnetic snap and 1 washer, and we're going to mark the placement for the snap according to the pattern. Then you're going to take the washer and center the whole of the washer over the placement mark and mark the slits of the washer. So if you're new to purse hardware, magnetic snaps are very easy to install, and it's a good piece to install for your first type of hardware. One other tip before I cut the slits for the prongs: take a pin and place the pin at the top of the slit mark, and then when you take your seam ripper to cut the slit, poke it through at the bottom of the mark and then push up, and you'll notice that the seam ripper will stop at the pin. So that'll prevent you from accidentally cutting past or too much of your fabric. I'm just going to move it to cut the other slit. Then you're going to poke the prongs of the snap through from the right side to the wrong side and flip your fabric over. Place the washer over the prongs, and I always recommend to bend the prongs away from the center to just help spread out some of that bulk. And then take a scrap of your interfacing and iron it over the wrong side of the hardware to prevent your lining. So I always recommend adding some glue to the back and then adding the interfacing so that way it's nice and secure and will last a long time. So then you'll take the other half of your magnetic snap and install it on your main fabric flap up from the bottom edge according to the pattern. So I've already went ahead and installed the other half of the magnetic snap on my flap, and the next step of the pattern is to round the corners of both of your flap pieces. So I've already done that for the main fabric, and I'll show you how to do that for your contrast fabric. So the contrast fabric will be on the outside, and then the main fabric will be towards the inside. So I'm going to flip this over with the wrong side up and take the template that's included in the pattern and position it in one corner. And you want to align the edges of the template with the straight edges of the template with the edges of your fabric. And then you're going to take a pen or a pencil, chalk, whatever is your preferred marking utensil, and just trace that curved edge And you'll just rotate the pattern piece for all 4 corners. And then just simply cut along the marked lines. So now that both pieces have rounded corners, if you are using a directional print, make sure that the direction on the cork fabric goes the same direction as the flap. So this will be in the front. So just kind of consider the final placement of the piece. And then you're going to put your flap pieces right sides together and align all the edges. And you never want to use pins on cork fabric. So sewing clips are very handy for bag making. So just clip all the way around, aligning the edges. Then we're going to sew these together with 3/8" seam allowance, leaving a 3" turning opening on the back side. So I'm just going to take my marker, and you'll want to make sure that it's on the back straight edge. So you don't want to leave part of the opening on the curves, just to make sure that the flap maintains its shape. So that way I have my start and stop points along the back. And the foot on this machine is nice and narrow. You might have to switch over to a zipper foot or a narrow foot, just depending on your foot and how close the hardware is to the seam allowance. So just keep the hardware in mind as you sew. And since we are doing piecing here, I've reduced my stitch length down to 2.5 millimeters. You don't want too short of a stitch length on cork fabric, because the more holes in the cork makes it less durable. So you want to make sure that it's secure but not too tight of a seam. So now we're going to add some little notches along the curved edges. You could either cut a notch shape, or you could use pinking shears along the curved edge to quickly cut the triangular shape to help reduce some of the bulk, or you could just go along and just cut a couple slits. So this will help relax the seam for a nice smooth cornered edge. And then turn the flap right side out. So just use your thumbs to work the fabric through that unsewn area. And this is where a turning tool comes in handy. So I'm using the Sallie Tomato Essential Turning and Creasing Tool. I'm going to use the curved end, poke it through the opening, and then just smooth out the edges. And since you can iron cork fabric, I am going to give this a quick press. If you're using faux leather, then I do not recommend ironing, but you can roll the seams and add sewing clips all the way around. And I'm just going to give it a quick press from the cotton side to just flatten out the seam a little bit. And at the turning opening, you'll want to turn the seam allowance in 3/8 inch to the wrong side and make sure that those folded edges are even. And add a couple clips to keep that closed for the moment. And then we're going to top stitch with an 1/8 inch seam allowance all the way around the flap. So I'm going to start at the back to close up that turning opening right away. And I'm just going to continue rolling the fabric to make sure that those curved edges stay smooth. And as I'm going along here, I'm rolling the seam so it's slightly towards the lining side, or which will be the inside of the flap, towards the main fabric, so that way from the outside of the bag, it'll be slightly hidden. So I like to trim up the threads as I go along the way. It just keeps the project a little bit cleaner. So here's what the flap looks like, all done. Next, you're going to take your back piece. So this piece does not have the magnetic snap attached to it. And I'm going to mark down from the top short edge 2 horizontal lines according to the pattern. So reference the pattern for those measurements. I'm just going to use my cutting mat as a guide with my ruler. And you can mark all the way across your fabric. So then you're going to position your flap so the magnetic snap is face down and towards the top, and you're going to align that lower edge of the flap along the top horizontal line and make sure that it's centered. So since we can't use pins on cork fabric, you could either apply some basting tape to this lower edge of the flap here. Another option is to use some washi tape, and you can sew right through the washi tape and then remove it afterwards. So you can just rip off a piece and tape your flap down in a couple spots. You could also add some wonder clips up at the top just to make sure everything stays positioned correctly. I'm a little off center. So now you're going to sew that bottom edge of the flap an 1/8 inch from the flap edge. And I recommend, if your machine has a triple stitch, you could use a triple stitch. You want this to be very secure. Or you can just sew a couple lines of top stitching. So I'm just going to pivot and sew back across to the starting point. And when I'm sewing the second line, I'm actually sewing right next to my first stitch line, so that way they're not directly on top of each other. It's a little bit more secure that way. And then you can just tear away the washi tape. So the next step is to attach the strap connectors. So take both of your strap connector pieces, and one tip is to take your ruler and mark a vertical line in from the long edge of the connector to mark the center. So I'm going to do that for both connector pieces. And now, over at the iron, you can just take the long edges and meet them along the center line and press. And then repeat for the other connector. And at the machine, we're going to top stitch a 1/4 inch from each long edge. And I like to flip it over so I'm top stitching from the right side that will show, just to make sure that my stitches look even. And repeat for the other piece. Now we're going to add a little bit more hardware. So take the rectangle rings for the pattern, and you're going to thread one connector through each rectangle ring. And you can add some stitches across right next to the rectangle ring. So you can use a zipper foot to get close, or a narrow foot, and just stitch as close as you can to the hardware across the strap. And make sure to backstitch. And repeat for the other rectangle ring. I'm just going to clean this up and trim some of the loose threads. So then take your back piece again, and you're going to position one of your connectors on each side of the bottom. So you're going to align the raw edges and position each connector in from the side according to the pattern. I'm just going to add a clip to hold it in place. And the same on the other side. And then you're just going to baste each of the connectors a 1/4 inch from the raw edge. So we're going to finish off assembling the back panel. So we're going to add the handle and the straps next. So I have a piece of webbing that's cut for the handle according to the pattern, and then 2 pieces which are longer for the straps. And then you'll also need 2 slider buckles, so it has that adjuster in the middle, so you'll be able to adjust your straps. And then you'll also need the back accent piece out of your contrast fabric. So beginning with the handle, make sure that your handle isn't twisted, and you're going to take the ends and position them according to the pattern. So I've already went ahead and measured in from each side edge and marked the placement which the outer edge of the handle will be even with. You want to make sure the raw ends are even with that upper horizontal line, and then just make sure that your handle is towards the top. So I am just going to hold this in place. You could use some basting tape or washi tape. And I'm just going to align it, and you're going to top stitch each of the raw ends with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And it's very important to back stitch, make sure your handle is secure. So next we're going to attach the straps. So start by taking 1 strap and 1 slider buckle, and you're going to thread the strap from the underside over that center bar and back down the other side. Now, since this is raw, we want to finish that off. So first fold the end a 1/4 inch to the wrong side, or the underside, and then you're going to fold it 1 inch to the underside again. So from the fold to the fold, it's about 1 inch. So it can be a little bit more than 1 inch if you need to, just to make sure that you get it underneath your sewing machine. And you can add a clip to hold it in place. And I'm going to flip it over so the underside is face up, and we're going to sew 1/8 inch and 3/8 inch from that folded edge. And again, make sure to back stitch. It's always a good idea to back stitch in bag making. And just make sure the hardware stays out of the way as you're top stitching. So again, I'm just going to trim up some of these threads, and then you'll repeat for the other strap and slider buckle. Now you're going to take one of your adjustable straps and have the underside face up, so that folded end. And I'm going to take my thumb and have it against the underside and just slide it towards the end to make sure that it's not twisted. So I still have the underside face up, and you're going to thread it through the buckle from the inside of the bag towards the outside and just pull it through. So now you're going to fold the strap so the undersides are facing each other, and thread the end of the strap back through the buckle. So here is what your strap should look like. So then that folded edge is hidden between the underside area. So still with the underside, so now the underside is towards the back of the bag. So now the underside kind of loops around because you're thinking about wearing it over your shoulder here, and you're going to have the underside face up and position the outer edge of the strap against the inner edge of the handle. And again, you could use some basting tape or washi tape to hold that in place, but I'm just going to do one strap at a time and stitch this down with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So then we'll repeat to attach the other side of the strap. And now that we have all these straps attached to the bag, just make sure that they are not underneath the bag. You wouldn't want to accidentally catch that in the seam. So next we're going to cover up all these loose ends here and just add a little bit more reinforcement. So that is when the accent piece comes into play. So I'm going to flip this over and add a small length along the center of our basting tape. And just press down to secure the tape and then remove the paper. So you're going to center this so the lower edge of the accent is along that lower horizontal line, and then just press down to secure. You can add some more washi tape to secure it, but I'm just going to hold it in place and stitch an 1/8 inch from all 4 sides. Trim up those loose threads and set the back panel aside. Next, we are going to work on the lining panels and adding the pockets. So our exterior is prepped, and we're moving on to attaching the slip pocket. So take your slip pocket pieces and you're going to place them right sides together and align all the edges and add some pins all the way around. So this is the same technique that I use throughout a lot of the patterns, so that way when you pick up a Sallie Tomato pattern, you become familiar with the process, and it just makes it a little bit easier every time that you go to do the pockets and the construction. So along the bottom edge, you're going to leave 3 inches unsewn, so you can mark that with your chalk or a pen. I'm just going to add 2 pins so it notifies me that there's a start and stop point. And you're going to sew all the way around with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And one tip is to trim the corners off. So this will help with a really sharp corner edge of our slip pockets. So just trim, just be careful that you don't cut through your stitches. And then through the turning opening, just push your fabric to turn it right side out. And again, I'm going to use my turning tool, and I do like using the curved edge and just running it along the seam to push out the corners. So over at the iron, just roll the seam to make sure that it's along the side edge. Everything is flat. And at the turning opening, you'll want to make sure that a 1/4 inch of the fabric on both sides is turned to the wrong side. So just make sure that the folded edge is even and press. So the side with the turning opening is going to be the bottom of the pocket. So we're going to top stitch an 1/8 inch along the top edge of the pocket. So then take your slip pocket and one of your lining front or back pieces, whichever one, and you're going to position the slip pocket according to the pattern. So just make sure it's centered and the top edge is down from the top edge according to the pattern, and add some pins to hold in place. So now we're going to top stitch an 1/8 inch from the sides and the bottom edge. Do not sew across the top because that will close your pocket. You want to make sure that you have access to that. So, and make sure to back stitch at the beginning and the end, since when you put things inside the pocket, there'll be some tugging and stress on the seam. So you want that nice and secure. And just another tip on slip pockets. So there are all kinds of variations that you can do here. If you wanted a place for a pencil, you could stitch a vertical line starting at the bottom edge and sewing up to the top and reinforce. Another option is you could stitch a second line of top stitching around the sides and bottom, 1/4 inch away from the 1/8 inch, just for reinforcement and additional embellishment. You could add embroidery to the outside of the pocket before you attach it. So I just included the basic options, but if you're ready for the next step and for your project, you might want to add some variations. So you can set the slip pocket aside, and next we're going to work on the zipper pocket. So grab both of your zipper pocket lining pieces, and you're going to press the bottom edge of each piece a 1/2 inch to the wrong side. So I'm just going to press this to show you what I mean. And I've already gone ahead and done it for the other piece as well. So on one of your zipper pocket pieces, you're going to measure down from the top edge and mark a horizontal line across. And then you'll measure down again and mark a second horizontal line. And you'll measure in from each of the side edges and mark a vertical line. So this is creating the placement box for the zipper opening. So once you have that marked, and you can refer to your pattern for all those measurements, you're going to place the marked zipper pocket piece on your other lining panel without the slip pocket, so either your front or your back, and you're going to center it according to the pattern and add a few pins. So this is a very small zipper pocket just because of the size of the backpack, so this might be nice for coins and chapstick, things like that. Now we're going to stitch along that placement box, so don't go past any lines that may be extending. And I always recommend reducing the stitch length for this step, so it will result in a better turn and cleaner seam lines, and it makes it for easier pressing. So I reduce it down to 2 millimeters for this step, and you're just going to sew right along the marked lines. So you can remove the pins and take your scissors, and you're going to just pinch the fabric in the middle so you can cut a slit through the layers. And you're going to cut along the center of the placement box. And you're going to stop cutting about a 1/2 inch from the vertical stitch line. And you're going to angle your scissors and cut a diagonal cut towards each of the corners. I'm going to flip it around and repeat for the other side. So next, I like to take a seam roller to get this step started and fold the pocket piece towards the placement box in each direction and just roll the seam roller along the seam to give it a hard crease, and it will help when you go to press it in the next step. Then you're going to bring the pocket lining through the opening. So just push it through. I'm going to flip it over so the wrong side of the lining is face up. So the pocket piece will be wrong sides together with your lining panel. And take the seam roller and just roll it along the seam edge. And you can take it over to the iron and give it a good press too. So now we're ready to add the zipper. I'm using Sallie Tomato zippers by the yard. So I cut the length that I needed for the pattern, and since the coil is nylon, you can cut and sew through the coil. And I'm using rose gold hardware on the outside, so it's fun to match the metallic coil zipper. So everything looks super professional. So I recommend using some basting tape and adding it along the long edges of the zipper. And with the zipper face up and your lining face up, you're going to center the placement box over the zipper so the raw edges are even and the coil is in the center of the box. And then you can press down to adhere the tape to the fabric. So you can add a couple pins or the washi tape if you'd like, but you're going to stitch an 1/8 inch from each side of the placement box. And as I reach the zipper pull, I'm going to lift up the foot and slide the pull out of the way. So here's what the zipper will look like installed from the front, and then what it should look like on the back side as well. So take your remaining zipper pocket lining piece and align all the edges. So make sure that the folded edges are even and the sides and the top. And we're going to start by pinning only the top edge together. So be careful that you don't pin through the lining. And I find it's easiest to sew this step with the lining face up, and then you fold it away from where we're going to be stitching along the top edge. So you're going to sew the top edge of the zipper pocket lining with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So next you're going to move away the right side of the lining, so just fold it out of the way and make sure that those bottom edges stay even. And add a couple of pins. And we're going to sew the right side of the zipper pocket with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now we're going to repeat for the other side seam, but this time you're going to start at the folded edges along the bottom and sew up. It's just a little bit easier to maneuver the piece under your machine. So do not sew along the bottom. We're going to use this as our turning opening for the final assembly of the bag. So definitely leave that open. It's very important to do that. And then also unzip the zipper all the way at this point. So now our lining is prepped and we're ready to move on to assemble the backpack. Okay, so grab your front, back, and side panels for your exterior and start with your front piece and one of your side panels and place them right sides together. You want to make sure that the magnetic snap is closer to the top edge. If you're using a directional print, make sure all of the pieces are facing the direction that you want them to. So align those long side edges and clip together. And we're going to sew the side with 3/8 inch seam allowance. So then take your scissors and trim the foam away from the seam allowance. Be careful you don't cut through your fabrics other than the foam, and be careful you don't cut through the stitches. And flip it over and do the same for the other side. So then over at the iron, you're going to press the seam open. So it's not going to be entirely flat because of the bulk of the foam, but a good press helps with the end results. So this is not included in the pattern. It's a little bit more of an intermediate technique, but if you want to top stitch an 1/8 inch from each side of the seam, you can. Just for the final top stitching, the last seam to attach, it's going to be a little bit more challenging to maneuver underneath the machine. So I'm not going to top stitch my backpack seams, but it's up to you. Just wanted to give you that option if you wanted it. So now we're going to attach the other side panel. So right sides together and align the left side edge, long edge, and sew together with 3/8 inch seam. So again, trim the foam and press the seam open. So before you attach the back, just double check that your magnetic snap is towards the top. You want your flap positioned towards the top, and we're going to sew the remaining side edges of the side panels to the side edges of the back panel. And just a reminder, make sure that your straps and flap, all the hardware, stay out of the way during this process. Next, take your base, your contrast base piece from earlier, and you're going to round all 4 corners just like before. So position that same template in each corner and trace the outer edge, and then take your scissors and cut along each of those marked lines. So next we're going to mark the center points along the bottom edge of the exterior and the base. So the bottom edge is the edge opposite of the flap, and you're going to fold and match the seams and just simply mark where the folded edge is, and that'll be the center on the back. We'll repeat for the front, and then each of the side edges. And then we'll mark the centers on the contrast base, so fold that in half in each direction to mark those. So you're going to place the base right sides together with your main fabrics, and you'll want the long edge of the base to be lined up with the front and back, and the shorter edges will be matched up with the sides. So start by matching up each of the center marks and add clips on each side. And then I like to align the straight raw edges and add some clips. And the more clips, the better, just to make sure everything stays aligned and won't shift on you as you sew. Also, make sure that all the straps and the hardware are tucked inside the bag and don't accidentally get flipped out. And then you can align the curved edges and clip those. And when you're clipping the curved edges, you can make sure that your side seams stay pressed open. So that'll help distribute some of the bulk. So now we're ready to sew the base to our exterior fabric. We are going to use 3/8 inch seam allowance, and like I always recommend, the base against the sewing machine is the easiest way to sew this step, so we'll sew all the way around the bag to attach the pieces. And I usually start on a straight edge. You don't want to start on a curve, it just is a little bit more challenging. So just double check that you caught all the layers. You can reach in and feel around the seam and just make sure that you caught the base and the seam. Then take your scissors and you can just trim the corners to about 1/4 inch wide. So just taking off a little bit of fabric, and that'll help when we turn the bag right side out for the corners to look nice and smooth. So you can set the exterior aside, and we're going to repeat the exact same process to assemble the lining. So here are all of our lining pieces. We have our piece with the zipper pocket, the slip pocket, our side panels, and the base. So start with one of your main panels. So I'm just going to grab the one with the zipper and one of your side panels, place them right sides together, and align the long edge. And you can add some clips or pins to hold the layers together. And this time, throughout the construction of the lining, we're going to use 1/2 inch seam allowance. So this method will make our lining just a little bit smaller, which will make the lining fit nice and snug inside our bag and won't be loose. And after sewing, trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch wide, and this will help reduce some of the bulk. And make sure to press the seams open as well. So I'm going to continue adding the side panel and the back panel the exact same way. When you go to attach the slip pocket piece, make sure that the opening is towards the top, so your zipper is closer to the top edge as well. Just double check that everything is going the correct direction. And next we're going to round each of the corners of the lining base just like before, so grab your template, mark and trim. Then just like the exterior, we're going to fold and mark the center points along the bottom edge of the lining panels and also the base. And with right sides together, align the long edge with the front and back panels. Match up the center points of the base with your lining. And then you can clip the straight edges and also the curved edges, just like before. And we're going to sew the base to the interior with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then you'll trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch wide. So now you can turn your lining right side out. And take your exterior piece, make sure that all the straps and the flap are tucked down inside the bag. And whichever direction you like your zipper pocket, if you want it towards the front, have it against the magnetic snap side, or you can flip it. So generally the zipper pocket is a little bit more bulkier than the slip pocket. So I'm going to put it against the snap side because we do have all the bulk of the flap and the straps. So that's just my personal preference, so it's up to you. And you're going to start by matching up those side seams. Make sure that each side seam is pressed open and add a clip at each side seam first. And then you can continue clipping around the top edge of the bag. So now we're ready to sew around the top. We're going to use 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way around. So as you may have guessed, we are going to trim some of the foam from the seam allowance just like before. It's always good habit just to reduce the bulk as you go along. So after trimming, we're ready to turn the bag right side out. So reach in and grab the lining and pull that out. And then reach through the zipper opening and bring the base of the bag through to the lining. And just push everything through. So again, reach through the zipper pockets and smooth out all the bottom corners. And before you put the lining down into the bag, we are going to close the turning opening. So pull the lining through the zipper and make sure that those folded edges are even, and add a couple of pins. And then top stitch that opening closed with an 1/8 inch seam allowance. So then you can push the lining back through the zipper and close the pocket and push the lining down into the exterior. So then we're going to roll that top seam, and you can add some sewing clips. So that way the seam is along the top edge. And again, I do like to roll the lining slightly in towards the interior a little bit more, so then it just has a really nice look along the top edge. So now we're going to top stitch around the top edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I like to start along the back side because that back stitching will end up getting hidden by the flap. So after the top stitching, you could certainly leave your bag as is, so it would close looking like this. So that's a little bit more beginner friendly, but I do challenge you to try the grommets. They are very easy to install, and the drawstring closure just adds a lot more security to the items inside your bag. So it's just a few more extra steps, and I know you can do it. So continue on with the pattern and mark the placement for the grommets. So I've already went ahead and done that. So you'll measure down from the top edge on the front and the back, and you're also going to measure in from the side seam and just mark a little dot for the placement of the grommet. So you're measuring down and in on each side of the front and then also the back. The side panels, it's a little bit different measurement. You're also going to measure down from the top edge and in from each side seam on both the side panels. So once you have all of that marked, I'm going to show you what the grommet looks like. So there are 2 halves to each grommet. I'm using snap together grommets, so there's no tools needed for these. Another style of grommets that we offer are screw together, so it's just your preference on which style you'd like. And the snap together ones look finished on both sides, but the screw together ones obviously have the screws on one side, which would go towards the lining. So it's up to you, and it depends on the style of your project as well. So you're going to take 1/2 of your grommet and center it over the placement mark. And you're going to mark that inner circle. And you're going to repeat for each of the placement marks. So after marking, the next step is to cut the holes. And you'll want to cut the holes about 1/8 inch beyond your circle marking. So that way the grommet has a nice tight fit and there's room for the metal fitting in between. So you can go around and mark with your pen if you'd like, just about 1/8 inch around. I'm just going to go through and eyeball it as I go. So I start the hole with a seam ripper, and you'll want to just poke through all the layers to make sure that your lining is flat against your foam piece. And poke through all the layers to start cutting the hole. And then take your scissors and you'll cut out the rest of the hole. And if you're nervous about cutting the holes for the grommets, you can always test fit your grommet. You can cut it the original size that you traced, and then test it to see if you need to trim a little bit more. And it's always better to start smaller and then trim extra when needed. You wouldn't want your holes to be too big. And then you'll just continue cutting out the rest of the holes. All right, so here I have all of the holes cut, and you're going to take both halves of your grommet and place them over the hole. And at this point, you can snap the grommets together with your hands. I'm not very strong though, so I'm going to grab a hammer and some scraps of my interfacing or foam to cover both sides and hit it with a hammer. So make sure that you're using a sturdy table, or even go outside and on the floor, or just a hard surface while you're pounding the grommets together. So I have this scrap of my interfacing, and I'm just going to fold it a few times. Place it on one side, fold it over the top to protect the hardware, and then just hit it firmly a few times. You just want to double check that it's secure in place, and then we'll continue around the entire top edge of the bag. So here's what the backpack looks like with all the grommets installed. And the last step is to make the drawstring and the tab for the drawstring. So you can set your bag aside for the moment. And we're going to start with the drawstring. So bringing this back to the ironing board, first you're going to press that end without any interfacing 1/2 inch to the wrong side, and repeat for the other side. And then you're going to press the strap in half along the entire length. So just fold it in half, match up those raw ends, and give it a good press. And then you're going to open up the strap and press each of the long edges to the center. And then we'll fold it in half again to encase those raw edges. So you can press this again, but I'm just going to hold it as I sew. You could certainly add some pins along the entire length, but since it is quite narrow, I'm just going to hold it as I sew. So we're going to sew an 1/8 inch from all 4 sides of the drawstring. And I usually start a little ways in from one end. Since this is such a narrow piece, it's difficult to start on the very end and for the feed dogs to catch the drawstring. So I'm just going to start about 1 inch in and make sure to backstitch. So after top stitching, you can set your drawstring aside for the moment and grab the drawstring tab. So over at the ironing board, we're going to press each of the long edges 1/4 inch to the wrong side. And then you're going to fold the ends 1/4 inch in again, so the folded ends will meet in the middle. So you can add some clips or pins to hold the folds in place, and we are going to stitch an 1/8 inch from each of the long edges and also an 1/8 inch from each of the center folded edges. So I'm just going to hold it as I sew, and instead of all of those loose thread tails, I'm just going to keep pivoting and sewing those top stitching lines. So it's completely okay to stitch along the raw ends as you do this. So now you're going to fold the drawstring tab in half, so it's right sides together, so the sides with the folds are the wrong side, and you're going to fold it in half, and we're going to stitch the raw ends together with 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now we're going to turn the tab right side out so you can finger press that seam open and just flip it right side out. And then you'll want the seam centered on the other side of the tab. So just press it down so the tab is flat. And then we're going to top stitch an 1/8 inch from each side of the seam. And I'm starting a little bit in from the edge so that way the presser foot doesn't push that top fabric and shift the drawstring. So I'm just going to start a little bit in and start by back stitching, and then I'll sew forward. So you can trim any of those extra thread tails. And grab your backpack, fold the drawstring in half to find the center. And then you're going to start in the back and have it centered between the back grommets. And you're going to feed one side of the strap in first, so go through the grommet from the top towards the inside, and then you'll just continue weaving through the grommets until you get to the front. So make sure as you weave through the grommets that your drawstring does not get twisted, and then you'll weave through the other side. And once you get the drawstring through to the front, you can adjust so that way the ends meet and it's evenly thread through the backpack. So at the front of the backpack, align the drawstring. Just make sure again that it's not twisted, and have your drawstring ends side by side. Take a safety pin and attach it to one end. And then you can push it through the tab. Make sure that the right side of the tab without the seam is facing forward, and then you can pull it through. So you may have to push it through the top to get it started, and then just pull it down. And to finish off the ends, I recommend to knot each end, so I'm just going to pull a little bit more through, and this will just prevent the ends from coming out of the drawstring. So now you can cinch your backpack closed. And then also secure the snap. So I hope you're excited to use your brand new backpack. This is a super fun pattern for students or for using as a hands-free purse for traveling and just everyday use. If you decide to make this project, we would love to see. So definitely share pictures with the hashtag MSQC Show and Tell so we can see it and celebrate your project with you. We do have one more project left in this series, and you aren't going to want to miss it, so be sure to tune into the next project that recaps all of the skill building techniques that we've learned so far. And if you just tuned in, be sure to check out the other projects that we've done so far in this series. Thanks so much for sewing with me today, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
Hi everybody, it's Jenny from the Missouri Star Quilt Company. We hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you aren't already part of the Missouri Star Quilt Company family, be sure to subscribe so you won't miss a thing. And if you click that bell, it'll notify you every time a new tutorial comes out.